Hey there. Today we are going to talk about the plot against Turkey and why it's failing. I lived in Turkey for 6 years, and I can tell you that the Turks are a very paranoid people. But after the past month, it is impossible to blame them for that. The US plot against Turkey is very real. On October 6th, the US president gave Turkey the go-ahead to invade northern Syria, a mission that Turkish President Erdogan had been threatening for years. Due to an international outcry, their offensive stalled before it actually got to any of the historic centers of Kurdish life in Syria. On October 22nd, a deal was signed between Russia and Turkey that should, in theory, work well for everyone. All the historically Kurdish areas will be run by the Russian and Syrian governments that the Kurds have been allied with throughout the war. And Turkey has blocked the formation of an independent Kurdish state on its southern border. The whole thing has been wrapped up quite quickly, with nowhere near as much loss of life as Turkey's incursion into Afrin in January of 2018. A couple hundred people have been killed, which is always tragic, but if you're being honest, it's hard to distinguish from the daily churn of this savage 8-year war. A month later, Turkey has changed the dynamics of the war dramatically, but hasn't taken any real cities or important Kurdish territories. To be clear, I do not support this action, and as I talked about last week, I think the Turkish occupation of northern Syria will end up being terrible for Turkey in the long run. Also, Erdogan invaded to shore up his domestic political position, not because Turkey was in any imminent danger. There absolutely were more peaceful ways to solve this. But if the deal between Turkey and Russia holds, this could be a real step towards peace in Syria. I see this as possibly being more progress than a problem. That is not the story we're being told in the United States. No, according to most US news outlets and politicians, what is going on in Syria is somewhere between the Rwandan genocide and the second coming of Genghis Khan. Current and retired US officials are using terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing, and some of the usually more respectable arms merchants at the Council on Foreign Relations are calling for a coup in Turkey. Wondering whether Turkey should be kicked out of NATO is now becoming a standard clever thing for media people who know nothing about the country or region to say. Again, this is all for an invasion that is largely over, has only killed a couple hundred civilians, has met its goals, and hasn't gotten close to the cities where large numbers of unarmed Kurdish people live. It is not a genocide. Watching this absurd media government spectacle, it's impossible to deny that there is some sort of plot against Turkey in the United States. Longtime viewers know that I don't usually like to talk about this, but yes, to some extent it does involve Israel. Since at least 2009, Erdogan has made himself a rock star across the Middle East and in a lot of Europe by occasionally speaking out about Israel's shameful treatment of the Palestinians. This bad blood reached new heights in 2010 when Israeli soldiers killed a bunch of Turkish activists for trying to get humanitarian goods into Gaza. Erdogan's attitude towards Israel has not helped him in Washington, D.C. His transition from admired Muslim Democrat to leading candidate for the next Saddam Hussein started with his Israel views, but he has added a lot of fodder since, from the suppression of the Gezi Park uprising in 2013 to the pointless arrest of an American missionary. As I've pointed out before, the right-wing elements that run Israel right now are just employees of the U.S. military-industrial complex. In 2012, with the end of Obama's Afghanistan surge and withdrawal from Iraq, that weird mix of defense companies, the Pentagon, and the journalists, think tanks, and congresspeople that work for them started looking for a new candidate to bomb. Turkey actually helped the U.S. military-industrial complex create their next lucrative enemy, the Islamic State, by creating a vast ungoverned territory for ISIS in northern Syria. But the military-industrial complex is always looking for its next victim, and despite his loyalty to the Get Assad project, Erdogan looked promising. This nexus between defense contractors, think tanks, and journalists is the reason why most casual news consumers in the United States think Turkey is doing a genocide right now. It's also the reason that the New York Times can print a headline like this, despite the body of the article making it clear that there's absolutely nothing to it. This is also why the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution on the Armenian genocide recently, successfully making every Turk who was angry at Erdogan angry at the United States instead. It's also the reason the Wall Street Journal can get away with printing an article like this, which came out in May of this year and still pisses me off immensely. This article takes some very serious historical truth, at least one outright lie, and mixes it together with such profound historical ignorance that it blows my mind. The Armenian genocide was very real, but the authors of this article have the same attitude towards history as those who deny that genocide. I think I will talk about this gobsmackingly malicious article in detail in a blog post on the website to avoid derailing this video any further. So the U.S. military-industrial complex and all of its employees, from the Israeli government to Fox News to the New York Times to Republican Senators Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham, are participating in a massive plot against Turkey. So is this plot going to succeed? No. Turkey is not leaving NATO. More serious sanctions against the country are not coming, and fantasies of Turkish regime change are going to stay in the fever swamps of the Council on Foreign Relations, where they belong. The U.S. military-industrial complex is powerful, but it's not as powerful as we pretend it is. I'm as guilty of blowing this out of proportion as anybody else. I've made a whole series on it. What the United States has done to Yemen and Syria over the past decade is horrible, but Raytheon and Boeing and the rest were allowed to destroy these countries because, economically speaking, Yemen and Syria just aren't all that important. Turkey is. Even after a rough few years, Turkey's economy is 20 times larger than Yemen's or Syria's were before their wars. Put simply, Turkey is just too big, rich, and important to be sacrificed to the U.S. military-industrial complex. Let's say you are Raytheon, a big U.S. defense contractor who would love the excuse to bomb Istanbul. So you tell your congressman to put Turkey under sanctions and start that process. But then McDonald's, a much larger corporation than Raytheon, starts complaining. They have over 250 franchises in Turkey and don't want to screw that up. Raytheon is a more fundamentally corrupt organization. It doesn't exist without its government relationships, so it's more powerful on this issue in Congress. But there are only 3 or 4 Raytheon-sized defense companies, and in a country like Turkey, dozens of McDonald's-sized U.S. companies have interests. Boeing, the biggest defense contractor, is about the size of McDonald's, but it also sells a ton of civilian planes to Turkish Airlines and Turkish low-cost carriers like Pegasus and Atlas Global as well. The Boeing lobbyists don't want to screw up a market Turkey's size. Even the military-industrial complex is divided on this one. That's why I'm pretty sure the 2016 coup in Turkey was not a U.S. operation, by the way. There are plenty of idiots in Washington, D.C. who would have been happy to help that happen, but the folks who actually run the U.S. economy and government are smarter than that. Obama did a lot of dumb shit that the military-industrial complex wanted, but he also would have had more important advisors who would have told him that he shouldn't risk destabilizing the Turkish economy. There are just too many U.S. companies making too much money there. You may be thinking of a couple counterexamples here. Venezuela and Iraq are 2 very obvious targets of the U.S. military-industrial complex, and they weren't Turkey-sized, but they were big economies before Washington, D.C.'s wheels started turning. But Venezuela and Iraq are prosperous because of their oil and gas resources. Turkey doesn't have any, or at least not enough to keep them from being super reliant on outside sources. That means that the big oil companies make money selling oil and gas to Turkey. Turning Turkey into a war zone would just kill a market and disrupt important pipelines. It wouldn't give Exxon any access to better deals for supply. So unlike Iraq and Venezuela, none of the oil companies have any interest in invading Turkey either. I haven't even begun to talk about the massive U.S. and multinational banking sector that is owed billions of dollars for their financing of Turkish power plants, shopping malls, and other infrastructure. You think Goldman Sachs wants to see cities it owns chunks of get bombed? You may think Russia is a counterexample here, but it's really not. Sure, Russia is an official enemy of the United States, but that's more about helping both U.S. and Russian companies sell weapons than it is about anything real. Nobody in Washington, D.C. actually wants regime change in Russia. If Vladimir Putin were voted out of office, the CEO of Raytheon would probably have a heart attack. Russia has supposedly been under these debilitating sanctions since 2014, but if you actually look at the list, they're not all that impressive, especially if you compare them to what we're doing to Iran. The United States is actively trying to starve that country to death right now. With Russia, outside of a few individuals and sectors, business as usual is largely proceeding, and it's looking like Europe is now eager to ramp business with Russia back up. The U.S. military-industrial complex is powerful, but when it tries to mess with countries with real economic weight, the complex gets reined in. So yes, there is a plot against Turkey, and it's pretty gross, but that plot is failing, and it's going to continue to fail. Netanyahu and Lindsey Graham can whine all they want. The U.S.-Turkish alliance isn't going anywhere. Some things are bigger than the U.S. defense industry's thirst for death. Turkey's economy is one of those things. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, and if you found this video useful, why don't you check out my crowdfunding thing on Patreon and learn how you can help keep this channel going.